Rain hammered the roof of the carriage as it lurched through the gates of Ashcombe Hall, and Margaret Ellery gripped the edge of her seat with both hands, trying not to think about how little money remained sewn into the lining of her cloak. The wheels struck a rut hard enough to throw her forward, and she caught herself against the window, staring out at a house so large it seemed to swallow the storm whole. Lightning cracked across the sky and lit the towers of Ashcombe Hall in a flash of silver, and for one moment the house looked less like a home and more like something waiting. She had left Bath 3 days earlier with a single trunk, a letter of introduction, and no other choice. Her father's debts had taken the last of the family's land, and her mother's cousin, a woman she had met only twice in her life, had written offering a position as companion to an elderly aunt at Ashcombe Hall. Margaret had read the letter by candlelight and told herself it was an opportunity. She had not let herself think too long about what kind of household needed a stranger from Bath on such short notice. The carriage rolled to a stop beneath a stone archway, and a footman hurried out with an umbrella that did little against the wind. Margaret stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the wet gravel, and looked up at the front doors as they opened. A woman in a dark gray dress stood in the entrance, her expression neither warm nor cold, simply watchful. "Miss Ellery," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. You are later than expected." "The roads were difficult," Margaret said, stepping inside as the doors closed behind her, cutting off the sound of the storm so suddenly that her ears rang in the silence. The entrance hall was grand in a way that made her feel smaller than she already did. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following her as Mrs. Whitfield led her deeper into the house, past a curved staircase and a hallway where the candles seemed to burn lower than they should. Margaret noticed that one long hallway, lit by a single lamp, held no portraits at all. The wallpaper there looked slightly less faded, as though something had once hung on it and been removed. "You will be companion to Lady Beatrice," Mrs. Whitfield said, not slowing her pace. "She is the Duke's aunt. She does not tolerate foolishness, so I suggest you keep your wits about you." "And the Duke himself?" Margaret asked. "Will I meet him this evening?" Mrs. Whitfield stopped walking. For a moment she said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if she had asked something forbidden. "You will see him," Mrs. Whitfield said finally. "Whether you meet him is another matter. His Grace keeps to himself. He takes his meals in his study, alone, and has done so for 15 years. No one in this house eats at his table. No one." She resumed walking, faster now, as if she regretted saying so much. "You would do well to remember that, Miss Ellery. It is not a rule anyone wrote down, but it is a rule all the same." Margaret said nothing, but she filed the words away, turning them over as she was shown to a small but comfortable room on the 3rd floor. She unpacked what little she had, changed out of her damp clothes, and sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. 15 years, that was longer than she had been an adult. What kind of grief, or shame, or fear could keep a man eating alone in his own house for 15 years and keep an entire household too frightened to question it? A soft knock came at her door, just as the dinner hour approached. A young maid, no older than 16, poked her head in. "Miss Ellery, ma'am, are you hungry? I can bring a tray up if you like. Most of us take our meals below stairs, but Mrs. Whitfield said you might prefer privacy your first night." "Where does Lady Beatrice dine?" Margaret asked. "In her rooms, ma'am. She's not been well, but there's a proper dining room if you'd rather. It's just that nobody uses it." "Why not?" The maid glanced over her shoulder, as though the empty hallway might be listening. "It's His Grace's table, ma'am. The long one, with the good silver. Nobody's sat there in 15 years, not since Her Grace passed. His Grace eats there sometimes, alone, at the head. Nobody else goes near it. It's just how things are done here." Margaret thanked the girl and sent her away, but she did not ask for a tray. Something in her, some stubborn thread that had survived the loss of her home and her family's fortune, refused to spend her first night at Ashcombe Hall, hiding in a small room eating alone, simply because a house full of strangers had decided fear was easier than company. She had spent the last year of her life being quiet, being careful, being grateful for scraps of kindness from people who reminded her constantly of her reduced circumstances. She was tired of it. She changed into her one presentable evening dress, a pale blue muslin that had seen better days but was still respectable, and made her way downstairs, following the sound of a single set of footsteps and the faint clink of silverware toward a room she had not yet entered. The dining room was enormous, lit by candles down the length of a table that could easily have seated 20. At the far end, alone, sat a man Margaret had not yet seen but knew instantly must be the Duke of Ashcombe. He was perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired, dressed simply for a man of his rank. with the kind of stillness that suggested he had trained himself not to react to anything anymore. A single plate sat before him, the rest of the table stretched away, empty, gleaming, untouched. He did not look up when she entered. Perhaps he assumed she was a servant. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart beating fast, and then she did the only thing that felt honest to her in that moment. She walked the length of the table and pulled out the chair directly across from him. The scrape of the chair against the floor was the loudest sound in the room. The Duke's head came up sharply, and for the first time Margaret saw his eyes, a gray so pale they seemed almost silver in the candlelight, and in them she saw something she had not expected, not simple anger. Shock, first, raw and unguarded, as though she had struck him. Then, quickly, the shock hardened into something colder. "Who let you in here?" he said. It was not quite a question. "No one let me in," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands, hidden beneath the table, were not. "I let myself in. I am Margaret Ellery, the new companion to Lady Beatrice. I was hungry, and I was told there was a dining room. I did not realize I needed an invitation to sit at a table in the house where I am now employed. You were told, I am certain, that this table is not used. I was told that no one sits here. I was not told why, and I confess I have never found silence a good enough reason to go hungry." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He studied her for a long moment, the silver eyes moving over her face as though searching for something, some sign of mockery or pity, and finding neither. "You do not know what you are doing," he said quietly. "Then perhaps you might tell me," Margaret answered, "instead of assuming I should simply obey a rule no one will explain." For a moment she thought he might rise and leave, might summon Mrs. Whitfield to remove her bodily from the room. Instead, he sat back slightly in his chair, and something almost like the ghost of surprise crossed his features, as if he had forgotten that people could speak to him without fear. "Pass the salt," Margaret said, nodding toward the small silver dish near his elbow, her voice as calm as if she were asking such a thing every evening of her life. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and slid the dish down the length of the table toward her. It was such a small gesture, and yet in that vast, silent room, lit by candles that had burned for 15 years, it felt as though something enormous had shifted. "You will regret this," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Perhaps," Margaret said, "but I have regretted worse things than a meal shared with a stranger." Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the meal, but neither of them left. A footman appeared once, carrying a second plate, and hesitated so long in the doorway that Margaret thought he might drop it. The Duke gave a small, almost invisible nod, and the footman set the plate before her with hands that trembled slightly, then retreated as quickly as decency allowed. Margaret ate in silence, aware of every sound in the room, the soft clink of silver against porcelain, the low hiss of the candles, the occasional creak of the old house settling around them like something breathing. She studied him without seeming to, the way one studies a locked door, wondering what lay behind it. His hands were steady when he lifted his glass, but there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth, a stillness in his shoulders that suggested a man holding something in place by sheer will. She wondered how long he had sat at this table alone, night after night, with no one across from him to notice such things. By the time Margaret finally rose from the table, the candles had burned lower, and the Duke of Ashcombe was watching her with an expression she could not read. It was not quite anger anymore, and it was not welcome either. It sat somewhere between the two, unfamiliar even to him, she suspected, judging by the faint frown that creased his brow as though he were puzzling over an equation that refused to resolve. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, rising and smoothing her skirts. He did not answer at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost reluctant. "Good night, Miss Ellery." She left the dining room without looking back, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire length of the long table. In the hallway, Mrs. Whitfield stood waiting, her face pale in the candlelight, her hands twisted together in front of her apron. "You sat at his table," the housekeeper said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might report the offense. "I did," Margaret said simply. "Do you understand what you have done? I understand that I ate a meal in a dining room, in the house where I now work. If that is a crime here, then I suppose I am guilty of it." Mrs. Whitfield did not answer. She simply looked at Margaret for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then turned and walked away without another word, leaving Margaret alone in the flickering hallway with the portraits watching her from the walls. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, her mind turning over everything that had happened, the fear in the maid's voice, the housekeeper's warning, the strange emptiness of that long table, and the look in the Duke's eyes when she had first sat down across from him. It had not been the look of an angry man defending his privacy. It had been something closer to grief, startled awake after years of careful sleep. She did not know yet what had happened in this house 15 years ago, but she knew, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that whatever it was not finished. The storm outside had finally begun to quiet by the time she reached her room, and she lay awake long into the night, listening to the last of the rain against her window, thinking of silver eyes and an empty table, and wondering what she had just set into motion. By morning, the story had already traveled through every corner of Ashcombe Hall. Margaret could feel it the moment she stepped out of her room, in the way the maids fell silent when she passed, in the way a young footman nearly dropped a tray at the sight of her. Some looked at her as though she had committed a terrible crime. Others, mostly the younger servants, looked at her with something closer to admiration. Quick glances filled with curiosity they did not dare voice aloud. She found Lady Beatrice waiting for her in a bright sitting room on the second floor, propped up against a mountain of pillows, her silver hair pinned severely back, her eyes sharp despite the frailty of her body. She looked Margaret over from head to toe before speaking a single word. "So you are the girl who sat at my nephew's table," Lady Beatrice said. Her voice was thin but carried an unmistakable authority. "Sit down, Miss Ellery. I find I am curious about you." Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed, folding her hands in her lap. "I did not mean to cause trouble, my lady." "Nonsense. Of course you meant to cause trouble. A woman does not walk into a room she has been warned away from, and sit down across from a duke without knowing precisely what she is doing." Lady Beatrice's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "I simply want to know why." "I was hungry," Margaret said honestly, "and I did not think an empty chair should matter more than a full stomach." Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, laughed, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to surprise even her. "Well, that is either the simplest answer I have heard in 15 years, or the cleverest. I have not yet decided which." She gestured for Margaret to pour the tea. "You will read to me in the afternoons, and you will sit with me when my joints ache too badly for company of my own choosing. In exchange, I will tell you things about this house that no one else will. Does that suit you?" "It suits me very well, my lady." Lady Beatrice sipped her tea, watching Margaret over the rim of the cup with the sharp attention of a woman who had spent decades reading people for a living, whether they realized it or not. "You are not what I expected. Most companions who come through that door are either mice or schemers. You seem to be neither." "I am not certain which category would please you more, my lady." "Neither pleases me," Lady Beatrice said. "I have had enough of both to last several lifetimes. What I want is honesty, Miss Ellery, and a spine. You appear to have both, though I reserve final judgment until I have tested you further." She set down her cup with a small, precise clink. "Tell me, what did you think of my nephew?" Margaret considered her words carefully. "He seemed a man carrying something very heavy, my lady, and very tired of carrying it alone." For a moment, something softened in Lady Beatrice's sharp features. A flicker of old sorrow quickly smoothed away. "Perceptive," she murmured. "Perhaps too perceptive for your own comfort, but we shall see." She waved a hand toward the window. "Go on now. Explore the house if you like. I find I tire easily these days, and I suspect you will learn more wandering these halls than sitting here listening to an old woman's complaints." Over the following days, Margaret settled into a rhythm. Mornings were spent with Lady Beatrice, reading letters and old novels, listening to sharp observations about everyone from the vicar to the neighboring gentry. Afternoons were her own, and she used them to explore the house as much as propriety allowed, always drawn back to that long, dim hallway with the faded wallpaper and no portraits. In the servants' hall, opinions on Margaret were sharply divided. A young footman named Peter, barely out of boyhood, told her in a low voice as he carried wood to the sitting-room fire that half the staff thought she was the bravest woman ever to set foot in Ashcombe Hall, and the other half thought she would soon be dismissed, or worse, and it would serve her right for tempting fate. A kitchen maid named Alice went so far as to bring Margaret a slice of warm bread one afternoon, unprompted, murmuring only that it was good someone had finally sat with his grace, before hurrying away as though she had confessed something dangerous. Not everyone was so kind. An older maid, thin-faced and disapproving, made a point of avoiding Margaret in the halls altogether, crossing to the opposite side of the corridor whenever their paths crossed, as though proximity itself might bring misfortune. Margaret said nothing to any of them, but she noticed, and she filed away every reaction as carefully as she filed away every fragment of the story no one would tell her outright. On the third afternoon, she found Mrs. Whitfield standing in that very hallway, staring at a blank stretch of wall as though she could still see whatever had once hung there. "There was a portrait here," Margaret said gently, coming to stand beside her. Mrs. Whitfield startled, then composed herself quickly. "There was. Of Her Grace, the late Duchess. His Grace had it removed, along with all the others, not long after she passed. He could not bear to look at them, I suppose." She hesitated, glancing at Margaret with something that might have been warning. "You would do well not to ask too many questions about Her Grace, Miss Ellery. Some wounds do not heal simply because time has passed over them." "What happened to her?" "An accident," Mrs. Whitfield said, too quickly, too flatly, in the tone of someone repeating a line she had said many times before, to convince herself as much as anyone else. "A terrible accident. That is all anyone in this house is permitted to say, and I would advise you to accept it as the whole truth, whether you believe it or not." She walked away before Margaret could ask anything further, her footsteps quick and uneven on the wooden floor, and Margaret stood alone in the dim hallway for a long while, staring at the pale rectangle on the wall where a woman's face had once hung. That evening, Margaret returned to the dining room, unsure whether she would find the Duke there at all after the events of the previous night. He was there, seated at the head of the table as before, and he looked up when she entered, his expression guarded, but no longer entirely cold. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would regret nothing," Margaret said, taking the same seat as before. "I did not think one meal would change my mind. Most people, once warned, do not return. Most people are not as hungry as I am, Your Grace, nor as tired of being told what they may and may not do in a house where they must earn their keep." He almost smiled at that, a brief flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone before it could fully form. They ate in near silence again, though the silence felt less heavy than before, less like a wall and more like a held breath. Margaret found herself watching him more closely this time, noting the way his gaze occasionally drifted toward the far end of the table, toward the empty chair that had once, she now suspected, belonged to someone else entirely. "You have questions," he said suddenly, not looking up from his plate. "I can see them on your face. You are wondering what happened to make an entire household afraid of an empty table." "I am," Margaret admitted, "but I do not think it is my place to ask, and I do not think you owe me an answer." "No," he agreed, "I do not." He set down his fork and looked at her directly, and for the first time she saw something raw in his expression, something he had clearly spent years trying to bury. "My wife died in this house 15 years ago. She fell from the East Tower stairs late at night, alone. It was ruled an accident. Society decided otherwise, and I let them believe what they wished, because the truth was no kinder than the rumor." Margaret sat very still, unsure whether to speak or simply listen. "You do not have to tell me more." "I know," he said. "I find oddly that I do not mind that you know this much." He picked up his fork again, though he did not eat. "Most people who learn even that fragment either flee the house or begin looking at me as though I might strike them down over the soup course. You have done neither. I do not frighten easily," Margaret said, "and I do not believe everything I am told, Your Grace, particularly when it is offered as the whole truth in a tone that suggests otherwise." Something shifted in his eyes at that, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. "You are an unusual woman, Miss Ellery." "I have been told that before," she said. "Usually not as a compliment. I meant it as one." They finished the meal with fewer words but a strange, fragile ease settling between them, the kind that comes when two people have each admitted something true without quite meaning to. When Margaret rose to leave, the Duke rose as well, an old courtesy that seemed to surprise him as much as her. "Miss Ellery," he said, as she reached the door. She turned. "Thank you. For the salt. And for not running." "You are welcome, Your Grace," she said, and left him standing alone at the head of his long table, though for the first time in 15 years, the emptiness around him did not seem quite so absolute. The following morning, as Margaret walked the garden path to clear her head before her duties began, she noticed a man watching her from the shadow of the stable block, tall and elegantly dressed, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Everett Thorne, cousin to the Duke, and something in the careful, measuring way he studied her made the hair on her arms rise even before he spoke a single unkind word. "So you are the companion who dined with my cousin," Everett said smoothly. "How very bold of you, Miss Ellery. I do hope you understand what sort of house you have walked into." "I understand it well enough," Margaret said, keeping her voice even. "Do you?" Everett's smile widened, though it remained cold. "I wonder if you do." "Julian is not a man easily trusted, Miss Ellery, whatever charm he may show you at a dinner table. I would hate to see a young woman of your circumstances caught up in something far larger than she realizes." He inclined his head, unhurried, unbothered. Enjoy your position here, while it lasts. He walked away before Margaret could answer, leaving her standing in the cold morning air with the uneasy sense that she had just met someone far more dangerous than a grieving duke and an empty chair. She mentioned the encounter to Lady Beatrice that afternoon, choosing her words carefully, watching for the older woman's reaction. Lady Beatrice's face tightened at the mention of Everett's name, her hands stilling in her lap. "Everett Thorne," she said, as though the name itself left a bitter taste. "He is Julian's cousin, and if my nephew never marries and never fathers an heir, Everett stands to inherit everything. The title, the estate, all of it." She looked at Margaret with unusual gravity. "He has been waiting 15 years for Julian to either remarry or waste away entirely, and I do not think he much cares which. Be careful of him, Miss Ellery. He smiles a great deal, and he means very little of it." "Does the Duke know how his cousin speaks of him?" "Julian knows a great many things he chooses not to fight," Lady Beatrice said, sighing. "It is one of his greater faults, though I understand why grief taught him to be so tired. Perhaps you might teach him otherwise. You seem to have a talent for walking into rooms other people are too frightened to enter." That evening, Margaret returned to the dining room once more, half expecting to find it empty, half hoping she would not. The Duke was there, as he had been each night, and this time he did not startle when she took her seat across from him. There was, instead, the faintest suggestion of relief in the way his shoulders eased. "Everett spoke with you," he said, before she had even unfolded her napkin. It was not a question. "News travels quickly in this house. Everett makes certain that it does, when it suits him." His jaw tightened. "Whatever he told you, Miss Ellery, I would ask you to weigh it carefully before you believe it." "I generally weigh everything carefully, Your Grace," Margaret said. "It is a habit born of necessity rather than natural caution, but for what it is worth, he did not strike me as a man overly concerned with truth." Something in the Duke's expression eased further, though the wariness never fully left his eyes. "No," he agreed quietly. "He is not." He looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to say more, and then seemed to decide against it, turning instead to the meal before him. But the silence that followed felt different from the silence of that first night, less like a locked door, and more like a room slowly, cautiously, being opened. 2 weeks passed, and Margaret found herself thinking less about her reduced circumstances, and more about the mystery pressing quietly against every corner of Ashcombe Hall. Dinners with the Duke had become a fixed point in her days, no longer a rebellion but something closer to a ritual, one both of them seemed reluctant to name aloud. They spoke of small things mostly, books, the weather, the odd habits of the older tenants on the estate, but beneath the surface of every conversation ran the same unspoken current, the tragedy that neither of them had fully addressed since that first honest evening. Margaret began to notice details she had missed before. The east tower, visible from her bedroom window, was kept locked, its narrow staircase never used by anyone in the household. When she asked a gardener about it, the old man simply shook his head and moved on to another task without answering. When she asked Nora, the young maid who had first warned her about the dining room, the girl's face paled, and she claimed not to know anything at all, though her hands trembled slightly as she folded linens that did not need folding. One gray morning, while walking near the old stable block, Margaret encountered a groundskeeper named Samuel, a stooped man with weathered hands, who had worked at Ashcombe Hall for nearly 40 years. He was trimming the hedges near the base of the east tower, and when Margaret paused to admire the ivy climbing its stone walls, he glanced up at her with an expression of quiet appraisal. "You're the one who sits with His Grace at supper," Samuel said, not unkindly. "Brave thing to do that, or foolish. Haven't decided which yet." "Perhaps a bit of both," Margaret admitted. Samuel gave a low chuckle and returned to his trimming, but after a moment, he spoke again, his voice lower. "I was here that night, miss. 15 years back. Wasn't near the tower myself, but I heard the shouting, same as everyone else on the grounds. And I'll tell you something the others won't, because I'm old enough now not to fear losing my position over it." Margaret held very still, afraid that any movement might silence him. "What is it?" "Her Grace weren't alone in that tower before she fell. Everyone assumes it was only her and the Duke arguing, on account of the shouting, but I saw a light moving in the east wing corridor not long after, moving away from the tower, quick-like. Wasn't the Duke's shape, near as I could tell in the dark. Too slight, too quick on its feet. I never told anyone. Wasn't my place, and no one asked an old groundskeeper what he'd seen from the stable yard at midnight." He shook his head slowly. "Been troubling me for 15 years, all the same." "Did you tell the magistrate, at the time?" "No one asked, miss. The matter was settled quick, quiet, and the family wanted it kept that way. I kept my silence because it seemed the safer thing to do, and because I had no proof, only a shape in the dark and a feeling I couldn't rightly explain. He looked at Margaret with something like relief, as though the confession had lifted a weight he had carried too long. You seem the sort who might do something useful with that, miss, where an old man like me never could. Margaret thanked him and walked back toward the house with her thoughts racing. A second figure, unaccounted for, moving away from the tower that night. It was not proof of anything, not yet, but it was the first thread she had found that suggested the tragedy at Ashcombe Hall might not have unfolded quite as simply as the household had been told to believe. It was Lady Beatrice, in the end, who offered the clearest fragment of truth, though she gave it reluctantly, in the manner of someone setting down a weight she had carried too long alone. Celeste was beautiful, Lady Beatrice said one afternoon, staring out the window at the gray autumn garden below. Beautiful and clever, and utterly wrong for Julian, though none of us understood that until it was far too late. She married him for the title, I believe, though she was skilled enough at pretending otherwise that even I was fooled for a time. She paused, her fingers tightening on the arm of her chair. There were quarrels, near the end, loud ones. The whole household heard them, though no one speaks of it now. What were they quarreling about? I do not know entirely, Lady Beatrice admitted. Julian never told me the particulars, and I never asked, which I have come to regret. But I know this much. The night Celeste died, she and Julian argued fiercely in the East Tower. Servants heard raised voices. And then, sometime later, she was found at the bottom of the stairs. Lady Beatrice's eyes met Margaret's, unusually solemn. Julian was the last person known to have been with her. He has never once in 15 years told anyone what was said in that room. And the Tun, always hungry for scandal, decided long ago that his silence was as good as a confession. Margaret sat with this for a long moment, turning it over carefully. You do not believe he harmed her. I know my nephew, Lady Beatrice said firmly. Whatever happened in that tower, I do not believe for one moment that Julian pushed his wife down those stairs. But I have watched that unspoken accusation eat away at him for 15 years all the same, because he will not defend himself, and because someone in this family has always found it convenient to let the rumor stand. Everett, Margaret said quietly. Lady Beatrice did not confirm or deny it aloud, but the look she gave Margaret said enough. That same week, Margaret's suspicion of Everett Thorne hardened into something closer to certainty. She encountered him again in the estate's small library, where he had clearly been waiting for her, standing near the shelves with a book he did not appear to be reading. Still here, Miss Ellery, he said, closing the book with a soft snap. I confess I expected you gone by now. My cousin is not known for keeping companions of any kind close for long. I am not easily discouraged, Margaret said, moving past him toward the shelf she had actually come to visit. So I have noticed. Everett's tone remained light, almost pleasant, which made the words beneath it all the more unsettling. You have been asking questions, Miss Ellery, about Celeste, about the tower. I would advise against it. Some doors are better left closed, for everyone's sake, especially yours. Is that a warning, Mr. Thorne, or a threat? Merely good advice, Everett said, smiling that same cold smile she had seen on their first meeting. Though I suppose the two can look remarkably alike, depending on who is standing on the receiving end. He set the book down on a side table and moved toward the door, pausing just before he left. You should also know, Miss Ellery, that I have written to Mrs. Whitfield regarding your continued employment. I do not think it wise for a young, unmarried woman of uncertain background to dine so frequently, and so privately, with a man of Julian's reputation. It reflects poorly on the household. I trust you understand. He left before Margaret could respond, and she stood alone among the shelves for a long moment, her hands curling into fists at her sides, anger and something colder, more careful, moving through her in equal measure. Everett was not merely unpleasant. He was actively working to remove her from the house, and she suspected his reasons had far less to do with propriety than with the growing bond between herself and the Duke. A bond that, however new and uncertain, seemed to threaten some careful arrangement Everett had built over 15 patient years. She thought of Samuel's words in the garden, of a slight, quick shape moving away from the tower on the night Celeste died, and found herself studying Everett with new eyes. He was neither slight nor especially quick in his movements, a tall man with an unhurried, deliberate way of carrying himself, but that did not mean his hand had not guided events from a distance, even 15 years ago. She resolved to learn more about where Everett had been that night, though she knew such questions would need to be asked carefully, and of the right people, if she hoped to receive honest answers at all. She found her opportunity 2 days later, when she encountered Mrs. Whitfield alone in the linen room. methodically counting sheets that clearly did not need counting. Margaret recognized the habit of a woman keeping her hands busy, to avoid thinking too closely on something else. "Mrs. Whitfield," Margaret said gently, "may I ask you something, and trust that you will answer honestly, even if the question is uncomfortable?" The housekeeper's hands stilled over the linens. "That depends entirely on the question, Miss Ellery." "Where was Mr. Thorne the night her grace died?" Mrs. Whitfield's face went carefully blank, the expression of a woman who had spent 15 years learning not to react to certain names. "I could not say, Miss Ellery. It was a long time ago, and I was occupied elsewhere in the house that night." "But you remember the night itself clearly enough. One does not easily forget the night a mistress of the house dies," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice tight. "But I would ask you, kindly, not to go stirring old ashes, Miss Ellery. Whatever you are hoping to find in them, I fear it will only bring more grief down upon this house, and upon his grace especially. He has suffered enough without a stranger digging up wounds best left buried. And if the truth might finally clear his name, rather than harm him further?" Mrs. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, something uncertain passing behind her guarded eyes, and for a heartbeat Margaret thought she might say more. But the housekeeper only shook her head and returned to her counting, and Margaret understood that she would learn nothing further from that particular conversation, not yet. She did not have to wait long to learn how far his influence reached. 2 days later, Mrs. Whitfield summoned her to a small office off the main hall, her expression grave. "Mr. Thorne has raised concerns about your position here," the housekeeper said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "He suggests it would be more proper for you to take your meals separately from his grace, and that perhaps a companion of your circumstances ought to consider a position elsewhere, one with fewer complications. Is that your judgment, Mrs. Whitfield, or his?" The housekeeper hesitated, and in that hesitation, Margaret saw the truth plainly enough. Mrs. Whitfield did not wish to dismiss her, but Everett's influence in the household, quiet and persistent, was not something easily refused. Before Mrs. Whitfield could answer, the door opened, and the Duke himself stepped into the room, his expression unusually sharp, unusually alert. Margaret realized, with a small jolt, that he must have overheard at least part of the conversation. "Miss Ellery's position in this household is not Everett's to decide," Julian said, his voice carrying an authority Margaret had not heard from him before, cool and immovable. "She was hired to attend my aunt, and my aunt is, by all accounts, quite satisfied with her company. That is the end of the matter." "Your Grace, I only meant," Mrs. Whitfield began. "I understand what you meant," Julian said, not unkindly. "And I understand precisely where the suggestion originated. You may tell my cousin, the next time he troubles you with his concerns, that Miss Ellery remains employed at Ashcombe Hall for as long as she wishes to stay, and that her arrangements, including where and with whom she takes her meals, are not subject to his approval." Mrs. Whitfield nodded quickly, clearly relieved to have the matter settled without further conflict, and hurried from the room. Margaret remained, watching Julian carefully, surprised by the firmness in his voice, the protectiveness that had risen so quickly and so completely on her behalf. For a long moment after Mrs. Whitfield's departure, neither Margaret nor Julian spoke. The office felt smaller, with just the two of them in it, the afternoon light slanting through a narrow window and catching the dust that hung suspended in the air. Margaret could still hear the echo of his voice, cool and certain, defending her position without hesitation, and she found herself oddly moved by the simplicity of it, by how easily he had stepped between her and his cousin's quiet cruelty. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, once they were alone. "I know," Julian said. He seemed almost as surprised by his own reaction as she was. "I find I did not much care for the alternative." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his expression that he did not bother to hide this time. "Everett has spent 15 years managing this household from the shadows, Miss Ellery, arranging small cruelties that no one could quite trace back to him. I let him, because it was easier than fighting, and because I told myself none of it mattered so long as I kept to myself, and gave him nothing to use against me." His jaw tightened. "I find lately that I no longer wish to make things so easy for him."
"What changed?"
Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Julian did not answer directly. Instead, he simply looked at her, that same unreadable expression from their first dinner together settling over his features, softer now, less guarded. "Will you join me this evening, Miss Ellery, at the table?" "I was planning to, Your Grace, with or without an invitation." The ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Somehow, I suspected as much. That evening's meal passed differently than any before it. The silences between them felt less like walls and more like companionable pauses. filled with an ease that surprised them both. When Julian reached for the salt before she could ask, sliding it toward her without a word, their fingers brushed briefly across the tablecloth, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as propriety might have demanded. "You have been asking questions," Julian said eventually, setting down his glass. "Mrs. Whitfield mentioned it, in her own careful way. She worries for you, I think, though she would never say so plainly." "I did not mean to cause her distress," Margaret said, "but I confess I find it difficult to sit quietly in a house so full of unspoken things." "Most people learn to look away," Julian said, watching her closely. "You do not seem inclined to learn that particular skill." "Should I be?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "No," he said finally, "I do not think you should. I spent 15 years looking away from my own house, Miss Ellery, and I cannot say it brought me any peace. Perhaps it is time someone looked directly at it instead." Margaret held his gaze, aware of how much weight sat behind those simple words, and did not look away. Outside the dining room windows, the last light of autumn faded into evening, and for the first time in 15 years, the long table at Ashcombe Hall did not feel like a monument to grief, but like the beginning of something neither of them was yet ready to name. Autumn deepened into a cold, clear November, and with it came a new kind of honesty between Margaret and Julian, one that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to welcome. Their dinners no longer felt like careful negotiations. They lingered longer over the meal, spoke more freely, and though propriety still governed the distance between them, something warmer had begun to grow in the space that distance left behind. Margaret found herself looking forward to the evenings in a way she had not expected when she first arrived at Ashcombe Hall, soaked through and frightened of her own uncertain future. She noticed small things now, the particular way Julian's shoulders relaxed once the servants had cleared the final course, the dry humor that occasionally slipped through his careful reserve when he spoke of his aunt's more outrageous opinions, the quiet attentiveness with which he listened whenever Margaret spoke of her own family, her father's failed investments, her mother's early death, the slow unraveling of a life she had once taken for granted. He never offered pity, only understanding, and she found that far more valuable. Lady Beatrice, for her part, watched the growing warmth between her nephew and his companion, with an expression of carefully hidden satisfaction, offering occasional pointed remarks that made Margaret's cheeks color, and Julian's jaw tighten in a way that was not entirely displeasure. One evening, after the plates had been cleared and the candles burned low, Julian set down his glass and studied Margaret with an expression she had not seen from him before, open and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch slightly. "I have never told anyone the whole of it," he said quietly. "Not my aunt, not the magistrate, not a single soul in 15 years. I find, oddly, that I wish to tell you." Margaret said nothing, only waited, sensing that any word from her might close the door he had just begun to open. "Celeste and I quarreled that night, as my aunt has likely told you by now," Julian continued. "We quarreled often in truth, though rarely so loudly. She had discovered something, a matter involving my father's affairs before his death, debts and dealings he had kept hidden even from me. She wished to use the knowledge to her advantage, to secure her own position should our marriage end, as she had already begun to suggest it might. I refused to be a party to it. We argued in the East Tower because it was the one place in this house where our voices could not easily be overheard, though it seems we were not nearly as private as we believed." "What happened after the argument?" Margaret asked softly. "I left her there," Julian said, his jaw tight. "Angry, and ashamed of my own anger, I walked back to my study and did not return. I told myself I would speak with her again in the morning, once we had both calmed. I did not know, could not have known, that I had spoken to her for the last time." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower still. "When she was found at the bottom of the stairs, I understood immediately how it would look. A husband, last seen, quarreling bitterly with his wife, who then falls to her death alone. I could have explained the nature of our argument, could have exposed my father's hidden debts and Celeste's intentions regarding them, but doing so would have dragged my father's name through scandal even in death, and hers besides. I chose silence instead. I told myself it was honor. I have since wondered whether it was simply cowardice, dressed in finer clothes." Margaret reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that he could close the distance himself if he chose. "It was not cowardice to protect the people you loved, even in their failings." "Perhaps," Julian said, "though it has cost me 15 years of being looked at as a man who may have murdered his own wife. I let the ton believe what they wished, because I did not think I deserved to defend myself, not truly, not when I had left her alone in anger on the very night she died." "You did not push her down those stairs," Margaret said firmly. Whatever guilt you carry over the argument itself, that is not the same as the fall. You know that, Julian, even if you have spent 15 years refusing to believe it. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the words seemed to land between them with unexpected weight. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his silver eyes, some old, tightly wound thing beginning, however slightly, to loosen. "You are the first person to say so with such certainty," he said quietly. "Everyone else offers pity, or suspicion, or careful silence. You offer conviction." "Because I believe it," Margaret said simply. "I have watched you for weeks now, Your Grace. I have seen the way you speak of your household, the way you defended me without a moment's hesitation when Everett tried to have me dismissed. A man capable of such casual cruelty toward his own wife does not carry himself the way you do. Grief, yes. Guilt, certainly, but not cruelty." Julian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached across the table and, for the first time, closed his hand gently over hers, his fingers warm despite the coolness of the room. Neither of them moved to break the contact, and for a long, quiet moment, the empty table around them seemed to hold not sorrow, but something closer to hope. "Thank you," he said finally, "for not looking away." "I told you before," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. "I do not frighten easily." The moment was interrupted, as such moments often are, by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway outside. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her face pale, holding a folded letter that trembled slightly in her grip. "Your Grace," she said, "forgive the interruption. This arrived for Lady Beatrice, but given its contents, I thought you ought to see it at once." Julian released Margaret's hand reluctantly and took the letter, scanning its contents with a deepening frown. Margaret watched the color drain slightly from his face as he read. "What is it?" she asked. "A letter from a friend of my aunt's, warning her that a rumor has begun circulating among the local families," Julian said grimly. "A rumor concerning Miss Ellery, and myself, and the nature of our arrangement in this house." He set the letter down, his hand curling into a fist beside it. "It suggests that Miss Ellery came to Ashcombe Hall with the express purpose of securing my affections and my fortune, taking advantage of a grieving, unstable man for her own gain. It further suggests that I am not entirely in possession of my senses, given the household's long-standing habits, and that my judgment regarding staff and companions can no longer be trusted." Margaret felt the color drain from her own face in turn. "Everett," she said quietly. "Almost certainly," Julian said, "though he has been careful, as always, to keep his own name well away from the actual words." He looked up at Margaret, something fierce and protective hardening in his expression. "This will not stand, Margaret. I promise you that." It was the first time he had used her given name in return, and despite the fear curling through her at the thought of the scandal already spreading beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, she found a small, steadying comfort in the sound of it. Over the following days, the rumor spread faster than either of them had anticipated. Invitations that had once arrived regularly for Lady Beatrice grew scarce. A neighboring family, once friendly with the household, sent their regrets rather than attend a small gathering Julian had planned, in an attempt to demonstrate that nothing improper existed between himself and his aunt's companion. Servants who had once treated Margaret with cautious warmth grew wary again, uncertain how to behave toward a woman now whispered about in every parlor within riding distance. Margaret felt the shift most keenly in the village, where she had gone one afternoon to collect a parcel of thread for Lady Beatrice's needlework. Two women she recognized from a previous visit to the church fell silent as she approached, their eyes sliding away from hers with a deliberateness that stung more than open hostility would have. The shopkeeper, normally friendly, counted her change with unusual haste, as though eager to see her out the door before the wrong sort of attention could settle on his establishment. Margaret walked back to Ashcombe Hall with her chin held high and her heart pounding, refusing to let a single tear fall until she had reached the privacy of her own room. She did not tell Julian about the encounter in the village, not wishing to add further weight to a burden he already carried. But Nora, the young maid, had apparently witnessed part of the scene from across the street and mentioned it below stairs, and word reached Julian by supper regardless. He said nothing about it directly, but his manner that evening was quieter, more deliberate, as though he were turning some private decision over carefully in his mind. Lady Beatrice, when she learned of the rumor, grew pale with fury, her thin hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Everett," she said, the name coming out like a curse. "He has finally shown his hand. The wretched, patient creature. 15 years of quiet scheming, and now he grows bold, because he senses something in this house is finally changing." "What do we do?" Margaret asked. "We do not hide," Lady Beatrice said firmly. Hiding is precisely what he wants. He wants Julian isolated, ashamed, easily painted as unstable and unfit. He wants you gone, frightened away like every companion before you. We shall give him neither satisfaction. She looked between Margaret and her nephew, something sharp and determined in her aged eyes. It is time this family stopped letting Everett Thorne write its story from the shadows. Julian nodded slowly, something resolved settling into his expression, a hardness Margaret had not seen from him before. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, settled determination. I have spent 15 years allowing my cousin to shape how this family is seen, because I believed my own silence was a kind of penance, a fair price for the guilt I carried over Celeste. I see now that my silence has cost others as well. My aunt's health, Margaret's reputation, this household's peace. He looked at Margaret, something fierce and tender mingling in his gaze. That ends now. What will you do? Margaret asked. First, I will discover exactly how far Everett's rumor has traveled, and who first gave it voice, Julian said. A rumor of this precision, naming specific details of our arrangement, did not simply appear from nothing. Someone spoke it aloud first, and I intend to learn who. He rose from the table, restless energy replacing the weary stillness that had defined him for so long. And then, Miss Ellery, I intend to make certain that whatever else is said of this house, no one may ever again suggest that you came here for anything other than honest work and honest company. Lady Beatrice watched her nephew with an expression of quiet, fierce pride, the kind of look Margaret imagined she had not worn in a very long time. Well, the older woman said, allowing herself a thin smile despite the gravity of the moment. It seems 15 years of silence may finally be coming to an end in this house, one way or another. The following morning Julian summoned Mrs. Whitfield to his study, and though Margaret was not present for the conversation, she learned its substance later that day from Lady Beatrice, who had her own quiet ways of learning everything that happened within the walls of Ashcombe Hall. Mrs. Whitfield had admitted, with visible reluctance, that Everett had visited the servants' hall on 2 occasions in recent weeks, speaking with several of the younger staff about Margaret's arrival and her growing closeness with the Duke, framing his questions as concern for the household's reputation rather than open hostility. It was, Mrs. Whitfield believed, from those conversations that the rumor had first taken root, carried outward by servants who visited family in the village, repeated and embellished with each retelling until it reached the ears of the local gentry as settled fact rather than careful suggestion. Julian had listened to this account in grim silence, according to Lady Beatrice, and had said only that he intended to speak with his cousin directly, man to man, without further delay. Margaret felt a knot of worry tighten in her chest at the thought of that confrontation, uncertain whatever it might do when finally challenged openly after 15 years of operating comfortably in the shadows. The confrontation Margaret had dreaded came sooner than expected. Julian found Everett in the estate's small chapel the following afternoon, a place Everett often visited more for its quiet privacy than any particular devotion, and though Margaret was not present, she heard the raised voices from the garden path below, carried on the cold November air. You will retract every word of it, Julian's voice came, hard and clear even at a distance, or I will make certain the whole county knows precisely what kind of man has been managing my household's reputation from the shadows for 15 years. Everett's reply was too low for Margaret to make out clearly, but his tone carried its usual smooth, unbothered confidence, the tone of a man who believed himself untouchable. Whatever he said seemed to enrage Julian further, and Margaret hurried toward the chapel, arriving just as the 2 men emerged, Julian's face flushed with fury, Everett's composed into an expression of wounded innocence that fooled no one who truly knew him. "Ah, Miss Ellery," Everett said, spotting her approach with a thin smile. "Perhaps you can settle a small disagreement. My cousin seems to believe I have done something terribly wrong in expressing concern for this family's reputation. I wonder if you might explain to him how reasonable my concerns actually are." "I think you know precisely how unreasonable they are, Mr. Thorne," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I think you have spent 15 years quietly managing this household's grief for your own benefit, and I think you are frightened, for the first time in a very long while, that your management is finally coming to an end." Something flickered across Everett's carefully composed features, gone almost before Margaret could name it, but she had seen it clearly enough. Fear, quickly masked, quickly buried beneath practiced charm. "You are a companion in this house, Miss Ellery, nothing more," Everett said, his voice cooling. "I would suggest you remember your place before you speak so boldly of things you do not understand." "I understand a great deal more than you would like, Mr. Thorne," Margaret said. I understand that a man does not spend 15 years quietly encouraging suspicion against his own cousin, unless he has something significant to gain from that suspicion continuing. I understand that inheritance is a powerful motive, and I understand that fear makes men careless, and lately, Mr. Thorne, you have grown careless indeed. Everett's jaw tightened, the pleasant mask slipping further. You know nothing, he said, his voice low and sharp now, stripped of its earlier smoothness. You are a penniless companion who stumbled into this house and mistook a grieving man's loneliness for genuine affection. Do not imagine yourself clever enough to unravel matters that have remained settled for 15 years. Perhaps they have remained settled only because no one troubled themselves to look closely enough, Margaret replied, holding his gaze without flinching. For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind Everett's eyes, and Margaret felt Julian shift protectively closer to her side, his hand finding hers briefly, a silent reassurance. Everett noticed the gesture, and his expression twisted into something colder still. You will regret this, Everett said, echoing, whether he realized it or not, the very words Julian had spoken to Margaret on her first night at Ashcombe Hall. But where Julian's warning had carried grief and reluctant honesty, Everett's carried only threat. He turned and walked away without another word, his composed stride betrayed only slightly by the tightness in his shoulders. Julian watched his cousin's retreating figure for a long moment, his own breathing still uneven with anger. He has never spoken to me so plainly before, he said quietly. Always careful, always deniable, every unkindness wrapped in concern or courtesy. Today, for the first time, I saw something closer to the truth of him. Fear does that to careful men, Margaret said. It strips away the performance, if only for a moment. Then perhaps we are closer to the truth than either of us realized, Julian murmured, watching the empty garden path where Everett had disappeared toward the house. I do not know yet what that truth is, precisely, Margaret, but I intend to find it, whatever the cost to my own peace. They walked back toward the house together in a silence that felt, for once, less like the heavy quiet Margaret had grown accustomed to at Ashcombe Hall, and more like the shared stillness of two people bracing themselves for the same difficult road ahead. That evening, unable to settle her thoughts after the confrontation, Margaret returned to the small library where she had first encountered Everett weeks earlier, hoping the quiet might help clear her mind. While searching for a book to occupy her restless thoughts, her fingers brushed against a loose panel at the back of a lower shelf, one that shifted slightly beneath her touch. Curious, she pressed further, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow gap behind the shelving where a small, dust-covered ledger and a bundle of letters had been hidden away, forgotten or deliberately concealed. Margaret's heart pounded as she carefully drew the items free. The ledger, upon closer inspection, appeared to be a record of financial transactions, dated some 15 years prior, detailing payments made to several individuals whose names Margaret did not immediately recognize, alongside notations that suggested discretion, silence, and favors owed. The letters, written in a hand she now recognized from documents Everett had signed regarding estate matters, spoke in careful, guarded language of an arrangement between Everett and a man identified only as G, discussing the late Duke's hidden debts and the leverage such information might provide, should circumstances ever require it. One letter, dated mere days before Celeste's death, mentioned a meeting planned in the East Wing, late at night, to discuss what the letter vaguely called a matter of mutual interest that Her Grace wished resolved before it could damage certain arrangements already in motion. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the ledger's brittle pages by candlelight, the small library silent around her except for the faint whisper of paper and the distant creak of the old house settling for the night. She read each entry twice, memorizing dates and figures, aware that whatever she held in her hands might be the first true crack in a wall of silence that had stood for 15 years. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, and for a moment Margaret glanced up, half convinced someone might be watching her from the doorway, though when she looked, the hallway beyond stood empty and dark. Margaret sat very still, the implications settling over her slowly, heavily. Everett had known about the very debts Julian had described, the ones Celeste had allegedly discovered and threatened to use against him. Perhaps Everett had known long before Celeste ever did. Perhaps he had been the one to first tell her, seeing in her ambition a useful tool against a cousin who stood between himself and the title he had always believed should have been his. She brought the ledger and letters to Julian immediately, finding him still awake in his study, staring into a low fire with the particular stillness of a man turning over difficult thoughts. I found these hidden in the library, Margaret said, setting the items before him. I believe they may explain more about that night than either of us realized. Julian read through the documents in tense silence, his expression darkening with each page, his hands gripping the letters tightly enough that the old paper crackled faintly under the pressure. "Everett knew about my father's debts," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "He knew, and he used that knowledge, feeding it to Celeste, encouraging her to press me for information, for money, for whatever leverage she believed she could gain. He wanted discord between us. He wanted exactly the kind of quarrel that would eventually occur in that tower." He looked up at Margaret, something cold and furious settling into his silver eyes. "He orchestrated the very argument that led to her death, Margaret, whether or not he intended for her to fall down those stairs that night." "There is more," Margaret said gently, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. "Samuel, the groundskeeper, told me weeks ago that he saw a second figure near the tower that night, moving away quickly, not long after your argument ended. A shape too slight and too quick to be you." Julian's face went pale. "You believe Everett was there, in the tower, after I left?" "I believe it is possible," Margaret said carefully. "I do not know it for certain, and neither of us should claim more than the evidence allows, but it would explain a great deal, Julian. If Everett went to the tower after your argument, perhaps to press Celeste further, perhaps to ensure she followed through on whatever plan he had encouraged, and something went wrong between them, a struggle, an accident born of his own scheming rather than yours. Then he has let me carry the weight of her death for 15 years, Julian finished quietly, while quietly working to inherit everything he believed should have been his from the start. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Margaret watched the man across from her absorb a truth far more terrible than the guilt he had carried for so long, a truth that offered him no comfort, only new and deeper anger. "We cannot simply accuse him without proof, stronger than an old man's memory of a shape in the dark," Margaret said carefully. "But this ledger, these letters, they are a beginning. If we can find Samuel willing to speak formally of what he saw, and perhaps the identity of the man Everett corresponded with, the one referred to only as G, we may be able to build something the magistrate cannot easily dismiss." Julian nodded slowly, some of the raw fury in his expression settling into something more controlled, more purposeful. "There is a gathering planned at Lord Camden's estate in a fortnight's time. Everett will certainly attend, as will most of the families who have lately chosen to believe the worst of this household. It would be a fitting place, I think, to finally bring this matter into the light, before witnesses who can no longer pretend ignorance once the truth is spoken plainly." "It is a risk," Margaret said. "If we are wrong, or if the evidence is not sufficient, Everett will use the accusation itself against you, painting you as a desperate man grasping at any excuse to shift blame." "I know," Julian said, "but I have spent 15 years being cautious, Margaret, weighing every risk until caution itself became a kind of prison. I find I am tired of it." He reached across the desk and took her hand, his grip firm, certain. "Whatever comes of this, I do not intend to face it alone any longer." In the days that followed, Margaret and Julian worked quietly to gather what proof they could. Samuel, when approached directly by Julian himself rather than left to volunteer information on his own, agreed reluctantly to put his account in writing, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he signed his name beneath 15 years of carried silence. A discreet inquiry through a trusted solicitor in London revealed that the man identified only as G in Everett's letters had been a private moneylender, long since retired, who confirmed, upon careful and confidential questioning, that Everett Thorne had indeed sought his services years earlier to trace the late Duke's hidden debts, information later passed, by whatever means, into Celeste's hands. Throughout this tense fortnight, the strain of the growing scandal had begun to take its toll on Lady Beatrice. Margaret noticed it first in small things, the older woman tiring more easily during their afternoon readings, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her teacup, a persistent cough that had not troubled her before. When the physician was called to examine her, he spoke gravely of the dangers of stress upon a heart already weakened by age, and cautioned the household against any further upset that might endanger her recovery. "You must not trouble yourself over Everett, or over the gossip in the village," Margaret told her gently, arranging the pillows behind Lady Beatrice's back with careful hands. "Julian and I are managing the matter. You need only rest and grow strong again." "Do not treat me as though I am made of porcelain, Miss Ellery," Lady Beatrice said, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Weakened by fatigue she could no longer fully disguise. "I have watched this family suffer under Everett's quiet cruelty for 15 years, and I will not be shielded from its final reckoning simply because my heart has grown tired along with the rest of me. Promise me only that Julian will see this through properly, whatever it costs him." "I promise," Margaret said, though privately the sight of Lady Beatrice's frailty deepened her resolve. and her fear, in equal measure. Whatever happened at Lord Camden's gathering, she understood now that the household could not continue to bear the weight of Everett's schemes indefinitely. Someone would break under the strain, whether it was Julian's fragile peace, Lady Beatrice's failing health, or Margaret's own carefully guarded reputation, and Margaret found herself determined that it would not be any of them. It was not perhaps proof enough to satisfy a court of law demanding certainty beyond all doubt, but it was more than enough, Julian and Margaret agreed, to finally break the careful silence that had protected Everett Thorne for 15 years, and to force the truth, however incomplete, into the open at last. Lord Camden's estate glowed with candlelight and the low murmur of gathered voices as Margaret stepped from the carriage beside Julian, her hand steady in his despite the nervous flutter in her chest. She wore a gown of deep green silk, a gift from Lady Beatrice, who had insisted, despite her physician's protests, on rising from her sickbed long enough to see Margaret properly dressed for what she called, with grim satisfaction, the most important evening of the decade. Inside, the great hall was filled with the very families who had, over the past fortnight, treated Margaret with cold suspicion and quiet whispers. Conversations faltered as she and Julian entered together, heads turning, fans lifting to hide murmured comments that were not nearly as discreet as their owners believed. Margaret kept her chin lifted and her expression composed, drawing on every ounce of steadiness she had built over months of difficult circumstances. Lord Camden himself greeted them at the entrance, a portly man, with a kind though uncertain smile, clearly torn between the demands of hospitality and the weight of gossip that had reached even his own household. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly to Julian, before turning a more hesitant nod toward Margaret. "Miss Ellery, we are pleased you could attend this evening." "Thank you for the invitation, Lord Camden," Julian said smoothly, though Margaret could feel the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior, could see it in the set of his jaw as his eyes swept the crowded hall, searching, she suspected, for a particular face among the gathered guests. They found a place near the center of the room, close enough to be seen by all, far enough from the refreshment tables to avoid the thickest cluster of whispering matrons. Margaret accepted a glass of ratafia from a passing servant more for the sake of occupying her trembling hands than any real desire to drink, and forced herself to meet the curious, judging stares around her with steady composure, rather than the retreat every instinct urged upon her. Everett arrived not long after, resplendent in a dark blue coat, moving through the crowd with his usual practiced charm, greeting old acquaintances with easy smiles that did not waver even when his eyes fell upon Julian and Margaret standing together near the center of the room. He approached them eventually, as Margaret had known he would, unable to resist the opportunity to needle his cousin in front of witnesses. "Julian," Everett said smoothly, "and Miss Ellery, how brave of you both to show your faces here this evening, given the delicate nature of the rumors currently circulating." His voice carried just enough to draw the attention of those standing nearby, exactly as he intended. "Brave, or simply honest," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying its own quiet authority. "Unlike some in this room, Everett, I have decided I no longer wish to let silence protect a lie." Something flickered across Everett's face, quickly masked, but Margaret saw it clearly, and judging by the slight widening of eyes among the nearby guests, so had several others. "I am not certain what you mean," Everett said carefully. "Then allow me to clarify," Julian said, raising his voice just enough to carry across the increasingly attentive hall. He withdrew the ledger from beneath his coat, holding it aloft for a moment before continuing. 15 years ago, my wife died in this house under circumstances that have haunted me every day since. I allowed the world to believe what it wished of me, because I believed my silence was protecting my father's memory, and perhaps my own guilt over a bitter argument that was, in truth, the last conversation I ever had with her. What I did not know, until recently, was that my cousin Everett had been quietly encouraging that very argument for months, feeding Celeste information about my father's hidden debts, information she then used against me, precisely as Everett hoped she would. A murmur rippled through the gathered guests, and Everett's composed expression cracked slightly further, a tightness appearing around his mouth. "This is absurd," Everett said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "I have no notion what document you are waving about, Julian, but I would advise you to consider carefully before making wild accusations in front of half the county." "Wild accusations," Julian repeated, his voice hardening. "Then perhaps you can explain, cousin, why your correspondence with a moneylender named G, discovered hidden in the library of my own house, discusses in careful detail the leverage my father's debts might provide, should circumstances ever require it." Or why a letter dated mere days before Celeste's death mentions a meeting planned in the East Wing, late at night, to discuss a matter you believed she wished resolved. Everett's face had gone pale now, his eyes darting briefly toward the door before he visibly forced himself to remain still, to maintain some semblance of composure before the watching guests. Letters prove nothing, Everett said, though the confidence had drained almost entirely from his voice. Correspondence regarding financial matters is hardly evidence of anything sinister. Perhaps not, on its own, Margaret said, stepping forward to stand beside Julian, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But there is also the testimony of a groundskeeper who has served this estate faithfully for 40 years, a man who saw a figure moving away from the East Tower on the night Celeste died, not long after the argument between herself and the Duke had ended. A figure too slight and quick to be Julian himself. She held Everett's gaze without flinching. A figure, Mr. Thorne, that I believe matched your own build quite closely, according to his careful description. The hall had gone nearly silent now, every guest straining to hear the confrontation unfolding before them, the usual polite murmur of a society gathering replaced entirely by breathless attention. You have no proof, Everett said, though his voice had begun to shake. An old man's memory of a shadow in the dark, 15 years past. It would not survive a moment's scrutiny before any magistrate. Perhaps not, Julian agreed. But it does not need to survive a magistrate's scrutiny tonight, Everett. It only needs to survive the scrutiny of every person standing in this room, all of whom will carry the tale home with them regardless of what any court might eventually decide. You have spent 15 years managing my reputation from the shadows, using whispers and careful suggestion to keep me isolated, ashamed and unwilling to defend myself. I find I have finally learned the value of your own methods. Everett's composure shattered entirely then, his carefully maintained mask falling away to reveal something raw and desperate beneath it. You do not understand, he said, his voice rising, drawing even more attention from the surrounding guests. Everything I did because this family deserved better than your father's mismanagement, better than the debts he left hidden, better than a duke too consumed by grief to properly see to his own affairs. I only meant to protect what remained of this family's standing. You meant to inherit it, Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the hall, sharp despite her frailty, as she appeared at the edge of the crowd, leaning heavily on a cane but standing nonetheless, having insisted on attending against every warning her physician had offered. Do not dress your ambition in noble language, Everett Thorne. I have watched you circle this family like a patient vulture for 15 years, and I will not stand by silently while you claim virtue for it now. The hall erupted into a low, urgent murmur of shocked conversation, and Everett looked around at the gathered faces, at the dawning realization in dozens of eyes that the story they had believed for 15 years, the story they had so eagerly repeated over tea and cards, had been built on a foundation far more twisted than any of them had imagined. This is not finished, Everett said, though the words carried none of their earlier menace, only the hollow defiance of a man who understood, at last, that he had lost. No, Julian agreed quietly, it is not. But it will be finished properly now, before the magistrate, with every piece of evidence we have gathered laid before him plainly. Whatever the courts eventually decide, Everett, you will not inherit this title while a single breath remains in my body, and you will not spend another day managing this family's reputation through whispers and careful cruelty. Everett looked around the hall once more, at the faces no longer offering him easy smiles or comfortable alliance, and turned to leave, his once confident stride now hurried, almost stumbling, as he pushed his way toward the door and disappeared into the cold November night. In the days that followed, the truth of Everett's schemes spread through the county with the same speed the original rumors had once traveled, though this time the story favored Julian rather than condemning him. The magistrate, presented with the ledger, the letters, and Samuel's formal testimony, opened a full inquiry into the circumstances of Celeste's death, and though the passage of 15 years meant certainty might never be fully achieved, the weight of suspicion shifted decisively away from Julian for the first time since the tragedy had occurred. Everett, facing both social ruin and the possibility of formal charges, quietly departed for the continent within the fortnight. His ambitions, finally, irrevocably ended. Lady Beatrice's health, freed from the constant strain of Everett's quiet threats, began slowly to improve, much to the relief of the entire household. The servants who had once whispered fearfully about Margaret now greeted her openly, warmly, as though the entire house had exhaled a breath it had been holding for 15 years. Mrs. Whitfield, in particular, sought Margaret out privately one afternoon, her expression uncharacteristically soft, as she offered an apology for the cold suspicion she had once shown. I should have trusted my own instincts sooner, Miss Ellery. the housekeeper admitted, wringing her hands slightly. I saw the change in his grace long before I allowed myself to believe it was real, and I let 15 years of caution keep me from welcoming what I should have welcomed from the very first night. You had good reason for caution, Mrs. Whitfield, Margaret said gently. This house taught everyone within it to fear hope. I do not blame you for needing time to believe it was safe again. Samuel, too, seemed lighter in his work about the grounds, whistling softly to himself as he trimmed the hedges near the east tower, which Julian had announced would finally be reopened, its narrow staircase repaired, its rooms aired and refreshed after 15 years of locked silence. It was, Julian said, time the house stopped treating an entire wing as a tomb. On a cold, clear evening in early December, Margaret descended the stairs to find the dining room transformed. Every candle along the long table had been lit, casting warm golden light across polished silver and fresh flowers Margaret had not seen in the house since her arrival. Julian stood waiting near the head of the table, dressed formally, his expression a mixture of nervousness and quiet joy that Margaret had never before seen on his face. Your Grace, Margaret said, glancing at the transformed room in wonder. What is the occasion? Come and see, Julian said, extending his hand toward her. She crossed the room slowly, her heart pounding, and as she reached him, he did not gesture toward the seat across from him, as had become their custom over these past months. Instead, he gestured toward the chair immediately beside his own, at the very head of the table, a seat that had remained as empty and untouched as the rest of the table for 15 long years. Margaret Ellery, Julian said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. You walked into this house on your very first night, and sat where no one else dared to sit, and in doing so, you gave me back something I believed I had lost forever, not merely companionship, but hope. I do not wish for you to sit across from me any longer, as a companion permitted a place at my table out of stubbornness or charity. I am asking you to sit beside me, always, as my wife, and as the Duchess of Ashcombe, if you will have me. Margaret felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, 15 years of the house's silence and her own months of uncertain circumstance dissolving into a single, overwhelming moment of joy. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Julian, I will. He drew her gently into his arms, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together in the golden candlelight, the weight of 15 difficult years finally beginning to lift from the both of them at once. I must confess something, Julian said softly, against her hair. That first night, when you sat down across from me so boldly, I was certain you would flee this house within the week, frightened off by grief and rumor, as every companion before you had been. I find I have never been so grateful to be wrong about anything in my entire life. Margaret laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to fill the vast dining room in a way it had not been filled in 15 years. I very nearly did flee, that first night, Your Grace, if I am honest. It was only stubbornness, and an empty stomach, that kept me in my seat. Then I owe your stubbornness a great debt, Julian said, smiling in a way that transformed his entire face, softening the careful, guarded lines grief had etched there over so many long years, one I intend to spend the rest of my life repaying. Around them, the long table that had stood empty and mournful for 15 years finally seemed to breathe with new life, its silver gleaming, its candles burning bright, no longer a monument to grief, but the beginning of everything neither of them had dared to hope for when Margaret first sat down, uninvited, and asked a grieving duke to pass the salt. 6 months later, Ashcombe Hall bore little resemblance to the silent, watchful house Margaret had first entered on a stormy night, soaked through and uncertain of her future. Spring had settled over the estate, and with it had come a transformation as complete as the one that had settled over Julian himself. The East Tower, once locked and forbidden, now stood open, its rooms refreshed with new furnishings and bright curtains, a place the household visited freely rather than avoided with lowered eyes and hurried steps. Margaret stood now in the great hall, no longer as a companion arriving uncertain and travel-worn, but as its mistress, watching preparations unfold for the evening's gathering, the first grand event Ashcombe Hall had hosted in over 15 years. Flowers filled every corner, gathered fresh from the gardens Julian had insisted be restored to their former glory. Musicians tuned their instruments in the ballroom beyond, and the long dining table, now polished to a brilliant shine, had been set for 40 guests rather than a single mournful place. You look nervous, Julian said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a man long accustomed to her presence. They had married quietly in March, in the small chapel where he had once confronted Everett, surrounded only by Lady Beatrice, the household staff, and a handful of trusted friends who had stood by them, even through the darkest weeks of scandal. "I confess I am," Margaret admitted, smoothing the skirts of her gown. "It has been a very long time since this house welcomed so many guests at once. 15 years, to be precise," Julian said, though his tone carried none of the old bitterness that once accompanied any mention of that number. "But I find I am not nervous at all, Margaret, only grateful." Lady Beatrice approached them then, moving with far greater ease than she had managed in months, her health continuing its steady improvement now that the household's long shadow had finally lifted. She wore a gown of deep burgundy, her silver hair arranged with careful elegance, and her sharp eyes surveyed the transformed hall with unmistakable satisfaction. "Well," she said, arriving at Margaret's side, "it seems the house finally remembers how to breathe." "Thanks entirely to you, Aunt Beatrice," Julian said, pressing a fond kiss to the older woman's cheek. "Your stubbornness taught me most of what I know about facing difficult truths." "Nonsense," Lady Beatrice said, though her pleased expression betrayed her. "It was your wife's stubbornness that did the actual work, Julian. I merely provided the encouragement, and occasionally the tea." She turned to Margaret with genuine warmth in her sharp eyes. "You have given this family more than you know, my dear. Not merely a happy ending, but the courage to stop hiding from its own history." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she squeezed the older woman's hand gratefully, unable to find adequate words for the affection that had grown between them over these past months. News of Everett Thorne had arrived only occasionally since his hurried departure for the continent, filtered through distant acquaintances and the occasional cautious letter from the family solicitor. He had settled somewhere in France, it was said, living modestly under circumstances considerably reduced from the grand inheritance he had once so patiently, and so cruelly, schemed to claim. The magistrate's inquiry, while never producing certainty sufficient for formal charges given the passage of so many years, had thoroughly and publicly cleared Julian's name, laying to rest at last the whispered suspicions that had haunted him since Celeste's death. Society, ever quick to follow wherever the tide of gossip turned, now spoke of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe with warm approval. The very families who had once shunned Margaret in the village, now eager for invitations to Ashcombe Hall's growing calendar of gatherings. Mrs. Whitfield, overseeing the final preparations for the evening with brisk efficiency, paused near Margaret long enough to offer a rare, genuine smile. "The silver has never looked finer, Your Grace," she said, using the title with an ease that still occasionally surprised Margaret, though she had grown steadily more accustomed to it these past months. "Nor has this house, if I may say so." "You may say so as often as you like, Mrs. Whitfield," Margaret said warmly. "This house owes you a great debt for holding it together through 15 difficult years." The housekeeper's eyes glistened briefly before she composed herself and hurried off to attend to the last details, and Margaret watched her go with quiet affection, remembering the frightened, warning voice that had first greeted her on that stormy night so many months ago. Nora, no longer the timid young maid who had once whispered warnings about the forbidden dining table, now moved through the household with a confidence Margaret liked to think she had played some small part in encouraging. The girl had been promoted to lady's maid that spring, and she fussed happily over the final adjustments to Margaret's gown, chattering about the guests expected that evening with none of the fearful hesitation that had once marked every conversation within these walls. "It hardly seems the same house, ma'am," Nora said, tucking a final pin into place. "I remember how quiet it used to be, how everyone walked about like they were afraid of waking something. Now there's music near every evening, and cook's always complaining about how much food we get through, and I don't think I've heard a single person whisper in weeks." "I am glad of it," Margaret said, smiling at the girl's easy chatter. "This house was never meant to be so quiet, I think. It simply forgot, for a while, how to be anything else." Peter, the footman who had once confided his divided loyalties to Margaret in her earliest days at Ashcombe Hall, now served as Julian's valet, a position he approached with visible pride and considerable seriousness, though he still occasionally slipped Margaret a knowing, warm smile whenever he passed her in the hallway, a silent acknowledgement of everything the household had survived together. Even the village had softened considerably in its treatment of the family. The shopkeeper who had once counted Margaret's change with nervous haste now greeted her by name whenever she visited, eager to share news of his own family, and the women who had once fallen silent at her approach now stopped to exchange pleasantries, some even venturing shy compliments on the changes they had noticed at Ashcombe Hall since the scandal's resolution. Margaret harbored no bitterness toward any of them. Fear, she had come to understand, made people cautious in ways that kindness alone could rarely undo, and she preferred to welcome their change of heart, rather than dwell on its slow arrival. As evening fell and the first carriages began arriving at Ashcombe Hall, Margaret took a moment alone with Julian in the quiet of the entrance hall, away from the growing bustle of arriving guests. Outside, the spring evening was mild and clear, nothing at all like the storm that had once ushered her through these very doors. "Do you remember what you said to me, that first night?" Margaret asked softly. "You told me I did not know what I was doing." "I remember," Julian said, smiling at the memory. "I have rarely been so wrong about anything in my life." "And do you remember what I told you when you warned me I would regret sitting at your table? That you had regretted worse things than a meal shared with a stranger," Julian said, drawing her closer, his silver eyes warm now in a way they had not been on that first cold, guarded evening. "I have thought of that often, Margaret, in the months since. How close I came to losing everything, to remaining alone at that table for the rest of my life, simply because I had convinced myself that grief and silence were easier companions than hope." "You are not alone anymore," Margaret said softly. "No," Julian agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead as the sound of arriving guests grew louder beyond the doors. "And I intend never to be again." Later that evening, as laughter and music filled Ashcombe Hall for the first time in 15 years, Margaret looked down the length of the long dining table, now crowded with warm faces and lively conversation, at the empty chair that had once stood as a monument to grief and silence, now filled, like every other seat at the table, with life and warmth, and the promise of everything still to come. She thought of the frightened, penniless woman who had once walked through that storm with nothing but a single trunk and a stubborn refusal to go hungry, and she smiled, understanding at last that the bravest thing she had ever done was simply refuse to accept that some doors were meant to remain closed forever. Lady Beatrice, seated near the head of the table beside a visiting friend from her younger years, caught Margaret's eye across the crowded room and raised her glass slightly, a small, private toast between the two of them, acknowledging everything they had weathered together to arrive at this particular evening. Margaret raised her own glass in return, feeling the warmth of the gesture settle over her like the candlelight filling the room. Julian appeared at her side again as the musicians began a new piece, extending his hand toward her with the same quiet courtesy he had shown her that very first night, when he had wordlessly slid the salt dish down the length of an empty table to a stranger who had refused to be turned away. "Would you do me the honor, Your Grace?" he asked, a teasing warmth in his voice as he echoed the formal title that had once felt so foreign between them. "I would be delighted, Your Grace," Margaret replied, taking his hand and allowing him to lead her toward the dancing that had begun in the adjoining room, leaving behind the long table and its many warm, familiar faces. As they moved together among the other dancing couples, Margaret caught glimpses of the house around her, transformed so completely from the silent, watchful place she had first entered. The portraits that had once been removed from the east hallway now hung again, including a newly commissioned painting of Celeste, restored not as a source of grief, but as a quiet acknowledgement of a woman whose own unhappiness, however entangled with tragedy, deserved remembrance rather than erasure. Julian had insisted on its placement himself, telling Margaret privately that peace, real peace, required honesty about the past, rather than its continued burial. The evening stretched on, filled with laughter, music, and the easy warmth of a household finally allowed to live fully in its own halls again. When the last of the guests had departed and the candles had burned low, Margaret and Julian returned once more to the quiet of the great dining hall, now empty again but for the two of them, the long table gleaming softly in the last of the candlelight. 15 years of silence, Julian murmured, looking down the length of the table where he had once sat entirely alone. "I hardly recognize this room anymore." "Nor do I recognize the man who once sat here so guarded and alone," Margaret said gently, slipping her hand into his. "I am glad of both changes, Julian." He drew her close, and together they stood for a long moment in the quiet, candle-lit hall, two people who had each, in their own way, learned that the bravest thing a person could do was refuse to accept an empty chair as the final word on their story. The Duke of Ashcombe's table, empty for 15 long years, would never sit silent again.